The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, and Jakob Eisner watched through the stone cathedral above him as 6 men stumbled through waist-deep snow toward his cabin, their faces desperate and frost-burned. 2 weeks earlier, these same men had called him a fool for building under a rock shelf in the middle of nowhere. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you'd like to see more forgotten frontier survival techniques, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might just save your life someday. Jakob Eisner sat on a flat stone outside his cabin door, one hand resting on the thick fur of his German shepherd's neck, watching the storm that should have killed him. The blizzard screamed across the Wyoming high country with the fury of something alive and murderous, wind driving snow horizontal across the landscape at speeds that would blind a man in seconds. But where Jakob sat, the air was almost still. Above him, a natural sandstone bridge arched across the sky like the roof of some ancient temple, and the storm that was burying the valley below couldn't touch him. The stone formation stretched nearly 60 feet overhead at its highest point, a massive arch of layered sandstone that had taken millions of years to form. The overhang extended 40 feet out from the cliff face, creating a protected alcove that swallowed Jacob's small log cabin and left room for a woodpile, a fire pit, and a clear area where snow never accumulated. The floor of this natural shelter was relatively flat, worn smooth by wind and time, and the stone walls curved around the space in a way that deflected wind while allowing smoke from his chimney to escape freely into the open air beyond the arch. His cabin sat back against the rear wall of the alcove, a simple structure of horizontal logs with 2 windows and a solid door. Warm light glowed from inside, and a thin stream of smoke rose from the stone chimney before being caught by the wind beyond the arch's protection and torn away into the white chaos. The cabin looked almost small beneath the massive stone overhead, like a child's toy placed in the palm of a giant's hand. Jakob had been watching the storm for 3 days now, not with worry, but with a kind of detached scientific interest. Every few hours he would walk to the edge of the protected zone where the stone arch ended and the open weather began. He would stand there, still in perfect calm, and look out at the wall of driving snow just 5 feet away. It was like standing at the edge of an invisible barrier. Inside the arch, peace and shelter. Beyond it, death. The dog lifted its head suddenly, ears forward, staring out into the storm. Jakob followed the animal's gaze and saw them. 6 dark shapes moving through the white, struggling against drifts that reached their waists. They were still a quarter-mile away, but Jakob recognized their movement, men on the edge of endurance, forcing themselves forward because stopping meant freezing. He knew who they were before he could see their faces. Settlers from the valley below, men who had laughed at him 14 months ago when he announced his intention to build a cabin under a rock. He stood slowly, the dog rising with him. The men were following the ridge line, the only route not completely buried. It would take them another 20 minutes to reach the stone bridge at their current pace. Jakob walked back to his cabin and opened the door. Inside, the air was warm from the fire burning in his stone fireplace. He added 2 more logs, then filled his largest pot with snow and set it on the heat to melt. When men arrived half frozen, they would need warm water before anything else. But 14 months earlier, Jakob had been just as desperate. Winter 1841 had been unusually heavy. Jakob Eisner and his wife Anna had built their cabin in the valley the previous spring, following the standard methods every settler used. Horizontal logs notched at the corners, mud and moss chinking, a gabled roof of pine poles covered with split shakes and sod. The structure was solid enough. They had survived their first winter without problems, and by their second year they felt confident in their little homestead. The cabin sat in a grove of aspens near a creek, good water and decent protection from wind. Jakob trapped beaver in the winter and worked a small garden plot in summer. Anna kept the cabin, tended chickens, and made their simple home comfortable. They were young, both in their mid-20s, and they had plans for children, for expanding their claim, for building a future in this hard country. Life was difficult, but it was theirs, and they were happy. The snow began falling on January 9th, not the dry powder that was common in Wyoming, but heavy wet snow that accumulated fast and stuck to everything. By evening, 6 inches covered the roof. By midnight, 12. Jakob woke several times during the night, listening to the cabin creak under the increasing weight. He considered going outside to shovel the roof, but the snow was still falling heavily, and clearing it in darkness seemed more dangerous than waiting for dawn. Anna slept beside him, her breathing quiet and even. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin interior was cold enough that their breath made small clouds in the darkness. Jakob lay awake, listening to the wind, listening to the logs settle and groan, listening to his wife breathe. He didn't know these were the last hours he would spend with her alive. Dawn came, gray and dim through the single window. The snow had stopped, but the weight on the roof had become enormous. Jakob estimated at least 18 inches of wet, heavy accumulation. He was pulling on his boots, preparing to go outside and start shoveling, when the center roof beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot. There was no time to react. The beam snapped, the supporting poles collapsed inward, and the entire center section of the roof came down in an avalanche of logs, shakes, sod, and snow. The weight of it was tremendous. Jakob was standing near the door, and the collapse caught him at an angle, knocking him down and burying him under debris, but not crushing him completely. Anna was still in bed directly beneath the center beam. Jakob fought his way out of the wreckage, choking on dust and snow, his shoulders screaming where a log had struck it. He dug frantically toward where the bed had been, throwing aside broken poles and chunks of frozen sod. When he finally uncovered Anna, she was already gone. The main beam had fallen directly across her chest. Death had been instant. He knelt in the ruins of their home, holding his dead wife, and felt something break inside himself that would never heal properly. Jakob buried Anna on the hillside above the creek 3 days later. The ground was frozen, and digging the grave took him nearly 8 hours of brutal work with a pick and shovel. 6 other settlers came to help, men and women from the scattered homesteads within a day's travel. They stood in the cold while Jakob placed his wife in the earth and covered her with soil and stones. Someone said words from Scripture. Jakob didn't hear them. After the funeral, the neighbors helped him salvage what could be saved from the collapsed cabin. The walls were still partially standing, and some of their supplies had survived undamaged. The general assumption was that Jakob would rebuild on the same spot, using the same methods. Cabin roofs collapse sometimes. It was a known risk of frontier life, terrible but not unusual. Several of the men at the funeral had stories of close calls with collapsing roofs during heavy snows. One family had lost a child to a similar accident 8 years earlier. These things happened. But Jakob couldn't accept that logic. As he sorted through the wreckage, pulling out bent cookware and broken furniture, a question formed in his mind that would consume him completely. Why did people accept that cabins failed? Why was a structure that couldn't survive heavy snow considered adequate shelter in a place where heavy snow was inevitable? The question seemed so obvious that he was surprised no one else asked it. He moved into a temporary shelter, a crude lean-to built against the intact wall of the ruined cabin. It was barely habitable, just enough to keep him alive through the remainder of winter. Every night he lay awake in the cold, thinking about shelter and failure and the fundamental problem of building homes in places that actively tried to kill you. The more he thought about it, the more obsessed he became. When spring arrived and the snow finally melted, Jakob didn't begin rebuilding. Instead, he started traveling. He visited every homestead within 3 days' ride, looking at how cabins were constructed and asking about failures. Most people thought his interest was strange, but answered his questions. Yes, they had experienced roof problems. Yes, heavy snow was always a concern. Yes, they reinforced their roofs before winter, but sometimes that wasn't enough. One old trapper told Jacob he had seen 7 different cabins collapse over his 30 years in the mountains. It was just part of life in this country. Jacob kept detailed notes. He sketched cabin designs, measured roof angles, calculated approximate snow loads. He examined collapsed structures when he found them, studying the failure points. The patterns became clear quickly. Roofs failed under weight. Walls failed when roofs collapsed on them. The fundamental design of a frontier cabin had a weight limit, and Wyoming winters sometimes exceeded that limit. No amount of reinforcement could change the basic physics. The solution, Jakob realized, wasn't building stronger roofs. It was eliminating the need for roofs entirely. By late spring of 1842, Jakob had become a strange figure in the scattered settlement community. He would appear at homesteads unannounced, spend hours examining collapsed or damaged cabins, ask detailed questions about construction methods, then disappear for days. He still trapped enough to buy supplies, but his obsession with shelter engineering had replaced any normal social life. Some people felt sorry for him, assuming his grief over Anna had damaged his mind. Others found him annoying and refused to answer his questions. Jakob didn't care what people thought. He was gathering data with the methodical focus of a natural scientist, documenting every failure mode and every weakness in conventional construction. His crude notebooks filled with sketches and observations. A cabin near Bitter Creek had lost its entire north wall when snow sliding off the roof had piled against it until the logs gave way. A homestead in the valley had experienced ice damming that sent meltwater flowing into the interior, ruining supplies and weakening the structure. A trapper's shelter, he found abandoned, had been positioned in a natural wind funnel, and the constant pressure had gradually shifted the whole structure off its foundation. The problem, Jacob concluded, was that settlers were fighting nature with construction. They built shelters designed to resist snow, wind, and cold through the strength of logs and the skill of their joinery. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes it didn't. The difference between survival and catastrophe often came down to how severe the weather became in any given year. Jakob's cabin had survived one winter and failed on the second. That wasn't acceptable. In early June, Jakob had a realization that changed his entire approach. He was examining a collapsed cabin when he noticed a section of wall that had remained intact while everything around it had failed. The wall was built against a large boulder, and the boulder had provided support that kept the logs from shifting. The shelter had failed everywhere except where rock provided backing. Jakob stood looking at that wall for nearly an hour, thinking through the implications. What if you didn't fight nature? What if you used natural features as part of the structure? Instead of building roofs to resist snow, what if you built where snow couldn't accumulate? Instead of constructing walls to block wind, what if you positioned your shelter where wind couldn't reach? The approach was completely backwards from standard practice, but it made perfect sense. Jakob began a new survey, this time focused on geology rather than construction. He explored the high country, examining rock formations and natural shelter opportunities. He found caves, but most were too shallow or poorly positioned. He found cliff overhangs, but they either faced the wrong direction or had unstable rock that might collapse. He was looking for something specific, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what until he found it. Jakob found the stone bridge on a cold morning in late June. He had been exploring a ridge system in the high country east of the settlement, following what appeared to be an ancient game trail. His dog ranged ahead, occasionally disappearing into the pine scrub before circling back. The country was rugged here, all broken rock and steep slopes, and Jakob was beginning to think the area was too difficult for any kind of construction when the trail curved around a sandstone outcrop and the formation appeared before him. It was a natural arch, a massive bridge of layered stone that spanned a gap between two cliff faces. The arch itself was at least 50 feet thick at its crown and stretched nearly 80 feet from one anchor point to the other. But what made Jakob stop and stare was the space beneath it. The arch formed a sheltered alcove against the main cliff face, a protected area with a relatively flat floor and enough vertical clearance to stand comfortably. The overhang extended approximately 40 feet from the back wall, creating what amounted to a natural roof that would never collapse, never require maintenance, and never accumulate snow. Jakob approached slowly, his mind already calculating possibilities. The floor of the alcove was weathered sandstone, relatively smooth, with a gentle slope toward the open side that would provide natural drainage. The rear wall was solid rock, rising vertically for about 15 feet before curving back to form the arch. The sides were partially enclosed by rock formations, providing wind protection while leaving the front open enough for light and ventilation. It was like someone had designed a perfect shelter and carved it from living stone. He spent the entire day examining the formation. He walked the perimeter, studying how water would flow during storms. He checked the stability of the arch, looking for cracks or signs of weathering that might indicate collapse risk. The sandstone was ancient and solid, erosion patterns suggesting the formation had been stable for thousands of years. He climbed onto the arch itself, testing the stone, examining the way it connected to the cliff face. Everything about the structure spoke of permanence and strength. The location was remote, nearly 4 miles from the nearest homestead, and accessible only by rough terrain. That would make construction difficult, but Jakob saw it as an advantage rather than a problem. Remote meant private. Remote meant no neighbors to question his methods or offer unwanted advice. Remote meant he could work without the constant judgment he had been receiving from the settlement community. He made camp beneath the arch that night, building a small fire and watching how smoke behaved in the space. The smoke rose naturally, drawn by air currents, and escaped cleanly without pooling under the stone. He noted the temperature. Even without a cabin, the protected alcove was noticeably warmer than the open country just 20 feet away. The stone had absorbed sun heat during the day and was radiating it back into the space. Jakob lay awake most of that night, planning. By dawn, he knew exactly what he was going to build. Jakob returned to the settlement in early July with a plan that seemed perfectly logical to him and completely insane to everyone else. He needed supplies for construction, which meant he needed to explain what he intended to build and where. The first person he told was Thomas Brennan, a fellow settler who operated the closest thing the area had to a general store. Thomas listened to Jacob's description of the stone bridge and his intention to build beneath it, then set down the axe head he had been sharpening and looked at Jakob with genuine concern. The objections came immediately. The location was too remote. Hauling materials 4 miles over rough terrain would waste weeks of effort. The stone arch might collapse. Jakob would be living under tons of rock that could fall at any moment. Winter access would be impossible once deep snow blocked the trails. If Jakob got injured or sick, no one would find him until spring. The whole idea was dangerous, impractical, and showed that grief had clearly damaged Jacob's judgment. Thomas suggested gently that Jakob should consider building something normal in a sensible location. Jakob tried to explain his reasoning. The arch was ancient and stable. The location provided natural protection that no constructed roof could match. The thermal mass of the stone would moderate temperature swings. The overhang would shed snow completely, eliminating the primary cause of cabin failures. But Thomas wasn't convinced, and when other settlers heard about Jakob's plan, their reactions ranged from pity to mockery. An informal gathering formed at Thomas's store the following evening. 8 men sat around discussing Jakob's proposed construction, and Jakob attended to answer questions. The conversation became heated quickly. Marcus Holden, A carpenter who had built half the cabins in the area argued that Jakob was abandoning proven methods for untested theories. Why ignore generations of building knowledge? Log cabins worked. They had sheltered people across the frontier for decades. Yes, occasionally one failed, but that was rare enough to be acceptable. Jakob countered that acceptable failures weren't acceptable when you were the one who died. His wife had been in an acceptable structure built using proven methods, and she was dead because heavy snow exceeded the design limits that everyone pretended didn't exist. The stone bridge eliminated those limits entirely. Several men shifted uncomfortably at the mention of Anna. Using his dead wife to justify his strange plan seemed manipulative to them, even if Jakob was simply stating facts. The meeting ended without resolution. Most of the settlers concluded that Jakob was going to waste months building something foolish in an impossible location, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. A few men offered to help if he reconsidered and built something normal. Jakob thanked them politely and purchased his supplies: nails, an axe, a saw, rope, canvas for temporary shelter, and basic foodstuffs. He loaded everything onto 2 pack horses and left the settlement the next morning. As he rode out, he heard someone say that they would probably find his body under that rock come spring. Jakob didn't look back. Jakob spent the first week simply living in the space and observing how it functioned. He built a temporary lean-to shelter against the back wall of the alcove and established a fire pit near the center of the protected area. His dog adapted immediately, seeming to understand that this stone cathedral was safe territory. Jakob watched weather patterns, noting how wind moved through the space where rain penetrated during storms, and how quickly the floor dried after precipitation. Every observation informed his construction plans. The floor presented the first major challenge. Unlike cabin sites in the valley where you could clear vegetation and dig foundation trenches in soil, Jakob was working on solid sandstone. The stone surface was relatively flat, but not perfectly level, with natural variations and slopes that would make building difficult. He needed to create level areas for his cabin without the ability to dig conventional footings. The solution required careful planning and precise stonework. Jakob began by mapping the entire alcove floor. He used a string level and stakes driven into cracks in the rock to establish reference lines. He marked high points and low points, measuring variations to the inch. The mapping took 3 full days, but when he finished, he had a detailed understanding of the terrain he was working with. The floor sloped gently from back to front, dropping approximately 8 inches over 40 feet. That natural drainage was perfect for keeping the space dry, but it meant his cabin would need to be leveled carefully. He selected a location for the structure about 12 feet from the back wall. This positioning would provide a walkway behind the cabin for accessing the rear wall, while keeping the building far enough forward to maximize the protected area under the overhang. The front of the cabin would sit approximately 25 feet back from where the arch ended, ensuring complete overhead protection even from wind-driven rain or snow. Foundation work began in the 3rd week of July. Without the ability to dig into stone, Jakob built upward instead. He gathered rocks from the surrounding area, selecting flat pieces that could be stacked stably. He created a series of stone piers, each one carefully leveled and positioned to support the corners and midpoints of his planned cabin walls. The piers varied in height from 6 inches to 14 inches, compensating for the natural slope of the floor and creating a level platform for construction. Each pier took hours to build correctly. Jakob would stack stones, test them for stability, add or remove pieces until the structure was solid, then use his level to ensure the top surface was perfectly flat and at the correct height relative to the other piers. He mixed clay and sand to create a crude mortar, filling gaps between stones to eliminate any movement. The precision was tedious, but Jakob worked with patience that bordered on meditation. Getting the foundation exactly right was essential. By early August, the foundation piers were complete. Jakob had created a level building platform exactly 16 feet long and 12 feet wide, raised above the natural floor and perfectly positioned to take advantage of the stone arch's protection. The relationship between Jakob's cabin and the natural stone formation was critical to his entire design philosophy. He wasn't simply building a cabin that happened to be under a rock. He was creating an integrated system where the natural and constructed elements worked together. This required thinking about shelter engineering in ways that conventional cabin building never addressed. Jakob spent considerable time studying the rock itself, understanding its properties and how they could enhance his structure's performance. The sandstone walls of the alcove absorbed heat during sunny days. Jakob verified this by touching the rock at different times and in different weather conditions. On clear summer days, the stone would be warm to the touch by afternoon. After sunset, the rock radiated that stored heat back into the space for hours. This thermal mass effect would be even more valuable in winter when any heat retention improved comfort and reduced firewood consumption. Jakob planned his cabin placement to maximize exposure to the back wall, allowing heat to radiate into his living space. The acoustic properties of the space were remarkable. Sound behaved differently under the arch than in open air. Voices carried clearly but didn't echo harshly. Jakob realized that this meant he would hear anything approaching the alcove long before it arrived. The space would amplify sounds from outside while containing sounds from within. This wasn't just interesting, it was tactically valuable. In a remote location, advanced warning of approaching animals or people could be life-saving. Water management required careful attention. During rainstorms, Jakob observed that water running down the cliff face would flow along natural channels in the rock before dripping from the overhang. None of this water entered the protected alcove directly, but during heavy rain, some would splash onto the outer edge of the floor. Jakob planned a small drainage channel along the front edge of his building platform, a shallow groove that would direct any water toward the lowest point, where it would naturally flow away from the space. The arch itself presented an engineering question that most people would consider a risk, but Jakob saw as an advantage. The massive stone structure overhead weighed thousands of tons. If it were unstable, that would be catastrophic. But Jakob's examination of the formation had convinced him of its absolute stability. The arch had stood for millennia. The erosion pattern showed weathering measured in geological time, not human timescales. The stone was solid. The connections to the cliff face were robust, and nothing about the structure suggested any collapse risk. More importantly, the arch's presence created conditions that no constructed roof could match. Snow and rain would fall on top of the arch, but the overhang meant nothing would accumulate beneath it. Wind would hit the formation and be deflected around the protected space. Temperature extremes would be moderated by the thermal mass. Jakob wasn't just building under a roof. He was building inside a natural environmental control system that had been perfected over geological time. He began cutting logs in mid-August, selecting trees carefully and hauling them to the site. Log selection consumed 2 full weeks. Jakob needed trees that were straight, relatively uniform in diameter, and free from significant rot or insect damage. He found suitable pines about a mile from the stone bridge, marking 28 trees that met his requirements. Felling them was straightforward work, but hauling the logs upslope to his building site tested both his strength and his ingenuity. Each log weighed several hundred pounds, and the terrain between the timber and the arch was steep and rocky. Jakob developed a system using his 2 horses and a simple drag harness. He would limb each tree, attach ropes, and let the horses pull the log along a route he had carefully cleared of major obstacles. The process was slow and exhausting. Moving one log from forest to building site took nearly 3 hours. But Jakob worked steadily, and by early September, all his logs were staged near the foundation piers. He stripped the bark from every log, using a draw knife, the same tool Samuel Bridger had used decades earlier for similar work. Removing bark was tedious but essential. Bark harbored insects, retained moisture, and created irregular surfaces that made tight fitting impossible. Jakob wanted logs that would stack cleanly with minimal gaps. Stripped logs also dried more uniformly and were less likely to twist or check as they seasoned. The work destroyed his hands, raising blisters that broke and bled before forming calluses thick enough to continue. The actual construction began in mid-September. Jakob used traditional horizontal log construction with saddle notches at the corners. He wasn't trying to reinvent basic carpentry, just apply it more carefully than most frontier builders bothered with. Each log was fitted individually, shaped where necessary to minimize gaps, and positioned to create walls that were as close to plumb as he could achieve working alone. The foundation piers provided a level base, which made the rest of the construction significantly easier. He built the walls one course at a time, rolling logs into position using levers and ramps. The work was physically brutal for a single man, but Jakob had become remarkably strong during his months of labor. Between each course of logs, he packed a mixture of clay and dry grass. This chinking would seal gaps and prevent air infiltration. Jakob had experimented with different mixtures and found that clay mixed with chopped grass created a compound that was both flexible and durable. The cabin was modest in size, 16 feet long and 12 feet wide, with walls rising 7 feet high. 2 windows faced outward toward the open side of the alcove, providing light and views while being protected from direct weather by the stone overhang. The door would face slightly to the side, positioned so that anyone entering would have to turn to see into the cabin, a small defensive consideration that Jakob included without conscious thought. By early October, the walls were complete, and Jakob began framing the roof structure, working beneath the eternal stone ceiling that made his efforts almost redundant, but still necessary for interior protection. The relationship between Jakob's cabin and the surrounding stone became most apparent when he began thinking about heat. A conventional cabin relied entirely on its fireplace or stove to provide warmth, fighting against cold that penetrated through walls, floor, and roof. Jakob's cabin existed inside a much larger thermal system, one that operated according to principles he was only beginning to understand but could clearly observe and measure. During late summer, Jakob had tracked temperature variations by simply paying attention to how the space felt at different times of day. The stone absorbed solar heat during daylight hours, warming significantly on sunny days. After sunset, that stored heat radiated back into the alcove for hours, keeping the protected space noticeably warmer than the open air just beyond the arch. The effect was modest in summer, but would be significant in winter when every degree of temperature mattered for comfort and fuel efficiency. Jakob positioned his cabin to maximize this thermal advantage. The back wall of his structure sat only 12 feet from the cliff face, close enough that radiant heat from the stone would warm the rear of the cabin. The proximity also created a sheltered zone between cabin and cliff where he could store firewood protected from weather and accessible without going outside during storms. This storage area became an unintended thermal buffer, an airspace that would provide additional insulation during extreme cold. The fireplace design required careful consideration of smoke behavior. In a conventional cabin, smoke rose through a chimney and vented to open air. Under the stone arch, Jakob had to ensure smoke would be drawn away from the protected alcove rather than pooling under the overhang. He studied smoke patterns extensively before finalizing his chimney design, burning small test fires at different locations and watching how air currents moved through the space. What he discovered was that the arch created a natural draft pattern. Cold air entered the alcove at the open front, warmed as it moved back toward the cliff face, then rose and flowed forward again near the ceiling before exiting. This gentle circulation meant that smoke from a properly positioned chimney would be caught by the outward flowing upper air current and drawn away from the living space. Jakob positioned his fireplace in the rear corner of the cabin, built the chimney to extend just above his roofline, and confirmed through testing that smoke vented cleanly. He constructed the fireplace using stones gathered from the surrounding area, selecting flat pieces that could be stacked to create a firebox and chimney. The work was exacting. Each stone had to be positioned precisely, gaps filled with clay mortar, and the entire structure built to draw properly while remaining structurally sound. Jakob had watched masons work in his youth and remembered the basic principles. A smoke shelf to prevent downdrafts, a narrow throat to increase draft velocity, and a chimney tall enough to pull air effectively. The completed fireplace was crude by professional standards, but functionally excellent. Jakob tested it extensively, burning fires of different sizes and watching how smoke behaved. The draw was strong, the firebox radiated heat efficiently, and no smoke entered the cabin interior. Thomas Brennan arrived at the stone bridge on a cold morning in late October, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies Jakob had ordered weeks earlier. Thomas had agreed to deliver the goods since he was curious about Jakob's progress and somewhat concerned that the isolated builder might be dead or injured. The ride from the settlement took most of the morning, following the rough trail Jakob had gradually improved with repeated travel. When Thomas emerged from the pine scrub and saw the massive stone arch, he stopped his horse and stared. The formation was more impressive than Jakob's descriptions had conveyed. Thomas had pictured a modest overhang, something like the rock shelters that occasionally appeared in cliff faces. What he saw instead was a geological cathedral, a space large enough to protect a dozen cabins if anyone were insane enough to build them there. And there, set back beneath the arch, was Jakob's cabin. From a distance, it looked absurdly small beneath the massive stone, like a toy structure placed in an alcove designed for something far grander. Thomas rode forward slowly, his experienced eye assessing what Jakob had accomplished. The cabin itself appeared well built, better than many structures in the settlement. The logs were straight and carefully fitted, the chinking looked competent, and the roof was properly framed and covered. But the location still seemed fundamentally wrong to Thomas. Too remote, too isolated, too strange. Jakob emerged. From the cabin as Thomas approached, his dog trotting beside him. They greeted each other civilly, and Jakob helped unload the supplies. Coffee, flour, salt, 20 pounds of nails, and several tools Jakob had ordered. Thomas accepted Jakob's invitation to see the interior, and they spent an hour sitting by Jakob's fireplace while Thomas voiced his concerns. The cabin was well built, he admitted, but winter would test it severely. The location was 4 miles from the nearest neighbor over difficult terrain. If snow blocked the trail, Jakob would be completely isolated until spring. If he got sick or injured, no one would know. The risk seemed disproportionate to any advantage the stone arch provided. Jakob listened patiently, then walked Thomas outside to demonstrate what he had built. He showed how the overhang shed precipitation completely, how the stone moderated temperature, how the acoustic properties provided advance warning of anything approaching. He pointed out that his roof would never collapse under snow because snow would never reach his roof. He explained the thermal mass effect and the natural ventilation patterns. Thomas followed along, nodding occasionally, but remained unconvinced. The fundamental disagreement, Thomas finally said, was philosophical. Jakob was treating shelter as an engineering problem that required a novel solution. Thomas saw shelter as a solved problem that required conventional execution. Building unusual structures in remote locations was how people got killed on the frontier. Safety came from proven methods in accessible locations where community support was available. Jakob's approach violated both principles. Jakob didn't argue further. He simply said that his wife had died in a proven structure using conventional methods, and he would not make the same mistake twice. November brought the first serious cold to the high country, and Jakob worked with increased urgency to complete his cabin before winter made construction impossible. The roof was his primary focus. Although the stone arch overhead provided ultimate protection, Jakob still needed a roof for his cabin to contain heat, provide privacy, and create a proper interior space. His roof would never bear snow load, which meant he could build it lighter and simpler than conventional cabin roofs. He used small diameter poles for rafters, spacing them closer than standard construction required. Over these, he laid split shakes he had prepared during evening hours throughout the fall. The shakes overlapped in traditional fashion, creating a surface that would shed any moisture that somehow penetrated past the stone arch above. Over the shakes, Jakob added a layer of canvas he had waterproofed with a mixture of linseed oil and pine tar. The canvas provided additional protection and created a finished interior ceiling that would reflect firelight and make the space feel more enclosed. The windows required careful construction. Jakob built frames from straight-grained pine, fitted with shutters that could be secured from inside. He had brought real glass panes from the settlement, expensive items that most trappers would never invest in, but Jakob wanted maximum light during the dark winter months. Each pane was set carefully into its frame with putty, creating windows that were both functional and reasonably attractive. The shutters could be closed during severe weather or for security, but most of the time Jakob planned to leave them open, allowing natural light to fill his home. The door was built from thick planks edge-joined and reinforced with Z-bracing on the interior. Jakob used his best carpentry skills for this element, creating a door that fit its frame precisely with minimal gaps. Heavy iron hinges supported the weight, and an interior bar bracket provided basic security. The door opened inward, which meant snow could never block it from outside, another small advantage of his protected location. Interior furnishing occupied the final weeks of November. Jakob built a sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the floor, creating storage space beneath while providing insulation from the cold stone. He constructed a table and 2 chairs using techniques his father had taught him decades ago. Shelves mounted to the walls would hold supplies and equipment. Everything was simple but well-made, functional, rather than decorative. He cut firewood obsessively, stacking cords of split pine in the protected space between his cabin and the cliff face. The stone kept the wood dry, and the quantity Jakob accumulated would last well into spring, even if he burned fires continuously. His dog had a designated sleeping area near the fireplace, a pile of old blankets that the animal quickly claimed as territory. By late November, the cabin was complete and genuinely livable. Jakob moved his remaining possessions from the temporary shelter, extinguished the last fire in his outdoor pit, and spent his first night sleeping in the finished structure. The cabin was warm, dry, and solid. The first significant storm of winter arrived on December 7, 1842. Jakob had been monitoring the weather carefully, reading the signs that mountain dwellers learned to recognize. The temperature had dropped sharply over 2 days, clouds had moved in from the northwest, and the wind had shifted to come straight down from the high peaks. By mid-morning, snow began falling in large, wet flakes that accumulated quickly on every exposed surface. Jakob sat inside his cabin, watching through the window as the storm intensified. Within 2 hours, 3 inches covered the ground beyond the stone arch. By afternoon, 6 inches blanketed the landscape. The snow fell heavily and continuously, the kind of storm that would have Jakob outside shoveling a conventional cabin roof every few hours to prevent dangerous accumulation. Instead, he sat comfortably by his fire, occasionally adding wood, watching the storm through glass windows while his dog slept peacefully on the floor. The stone arch overhead remained completely free of snow. The precipitation fell on top of the formation and slid down the exterior slopes, but nothing accumulated on the underside or within the protected alcove. The ground immediately in front of Jakob's cabin stayed clear, except for occasional flakes that blew in on wind gusts before melting from residual ground warmth. His woodpile remained accessible and dry. His door was never blocked. The effect was exactly what Jacob had predicted, but seeing it function in a real storm brought a deep satisfaction that felt like vindication. Temperature inside the cabin remained comfortable with only a modest fire burning. The stone walls of the alcove radiated stored heat. The cabin's walls and roof contained that warmth efficiently, and the lack of wind eliminated the primary cause of heat loss. Jacob estimated he was using half the firewood he would need in a conventional cabin to maintain the same interior temperature. Over a full winter, that difference would be substantial, both in terms of labor and fuel consumption. The storm continued through the night and into the following day. By the time it ended, nearly 14 inches of heavy, wet snow covered the valley below. Jakob bundled up and hiked down to where he could see the settlement. Even from a distance, he could see smoke from multiple cabins, evidence of people working hard to stay warm. He knew that most settlers would have spent hours on their roofs during the storm, shoveling snow to prevent dangerous buildup. Some would have stayed awake all night, listening nervously for sounds of structural stress. Jakob returned to his cabin and spent the evening by his fire, writing in a journal he had started keeping. He documented the storm, his cabin's performance, and his observations about thermal efficiency. The writing wasn't for publication or posterity, just personal records that helped him organize his thoughts about what he had built. Winter settled over the Wyoming high country with the weight of something that intended to stay. After the December storm came 3 weeks of bitter cold, temperatures dropping well below zero at night and barely rising above freezing during the day. Jakob made 2 trips to the settlement during this period, riding down to purchase supplies and check on conditions. What he saw confirmed that his unconventional approach to shelter had been correct. The settlement's cabins were struggling. Marcus Holden had suffered a partial roof collapse when ice dammed his chimney area and the weight became too concentrated on weakened rafters. He had repaired it, but the work had required help from 3 other men and a full day of dangerous labor in freezing conditions. The Peterson family cabin had developed such severe drafts from chinking that had dried and cracked that they were burning nearly twice their anticipated firewood supply. Several families were sleeping in shifts with someone awake at all times to monitor roof stress and maintain fires. Jakob purchased his supplies quickly, avoiding extended conversations. People asked polite questions about his remote cabin, and he gave brief, factual answers. Yes, he was managing fine. No, he wasn't having any structural problems. Yes, he had adequate firewood. The questions carried an undertone of skepticism, as if people expected him to admit failure and ask for help. When he didn't, the conversations became awkward and ended quickly. Thomas Brennan pulled Jacob aside before he left, speaking quietly so others wouldn't overhear. Thomas admitted that he had been wrong about some things. Jacob's cabin was clearly functioning better than expected. The stone bridge was providing advantages that Thomas hadn't fully appreciated. But Thomas still maintained that the isolation was dangerous and that Jacob was gambling his life on the assumption that nothing would go wrong. One serious injury or illness, and Jacob would die alone up there before anyone knew he needed help. Jacob acknowledged the risk, but pointed out that Anna had died surrounded by neighbors and community, and proximity hadn't saved her. Risk was inherent to frontier life, regardless of location. He preferred the risks he had chosen over the risks everyone else accepted as normal. Thomas had no response to that, and Jakob rode back to his stone bridge cabin, leading a pack horse loaded with flour, coffee, and a few luxury items he had purchased. January brought more snow, not dramatic storms, but steady accumulation that gradually buried the valley under several feet of white. Jacob's trail became difficult to navigate, and he stopped making trips to the settlement. He wasn't isolated in any meaningful sense, since he had everything he needed, but the physical connection to the community had been severed by weather. The storm that would validate Jacob's entire approach began as a distant line of clouds on the morning of January 23, 1843. Jakob had been living alone under the stone bridge for 5 months, and he had developed an intimate understanding of weather patterns in the high country. This storm looked different from the typical systems that brought snow to the region. The clouds were massive, towering structures that reached high into the atmosphere, and they moved slowly as if weighted down by the moisture they carried. By afternoon, the temperature had risen above freezing, despite being late January. This was a dangerous sign. Warm air ahead of a winter storm meant the precipitation would fall as heavy, wet snow rather than dry powder. Wet snow accumulated in thick layers, stuck to surfaces, and weighed substantially more than the light snow that typically fell in Wyoming winters. This was the kind of storm that collapsed roofs and buried livestock and tested every structure to its limits. Jakob prepared methodically. He brought extra firewood inside the cabin, stacking it near the fireplace where it would stay dry. He filled every container he owned with water from the creek, knowing that if the storm was as severe as he suspected, he wouldn't want to leave the cabin for days. He checked his food supplies and confirmed he had enough for 2 weeks if necessary. He secured the shutters on his windows and made sure the door bar was functioning properly. The dog sensed his preparations and stayed close, occasionally whining softly. The snow began falling just before dark, large, wet flakes that fell slowly and accumulated quickly. Within an hour, 2 inches covered the ground beyond the protected alcove. Jakob lit his fire and settled in to wait. He had no concern for his own safety. The stone arch overhead was impervious to any amount of snow, and his cabin had been designed specifically for conditions like this. But he thought about the settlement and wondered how the conventional cabins would fare. By midnight, 6 inches of heavy snow had fallen, and the storm showed no signs of diminishing. Jakob stood at the edge of the protected space, just inside the line where the arch's overhang ended, and watched the storm. It was like standing at the boundary between 2 different worlds. Behind him, calm and shelter. Ahead, driving snow and wind and conditions that would kill an exposed person within hours. The contrast was stark and somehow beautiful in its clarity. He returned to his cabin and lay in his bed, listening to the wind. The sound was distant and muted, filtered through the protective geometry of the stone formation. His dog slept peacefully. The fire burned low but steady. Jakob felt no anxiety, no fear, just a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had built something that could withstand whatever nature delivered. Outside, the storm intensified through the night, and in the valley below, the settlement was beginning to experience serious trouble. The first cabin roof failed in the settlement just after dawn on the second day of the storm. The structure belonged to a family named Morrison, who had built their home the previous spring using standard methods. The roof had seemed adequate through one winter, but the current storm exceeded anything the design could handle. Approximately 16 inches of wet, heavy snow had accumulated on the roof when the center beam cracked with a sound that woke the entire family. They evacuated immediately, grabbing what they could carry and running to a neighbor's cabin before the full collapse occurred minutes later. By midday, 3 more roofs had failed partially or completely. The Peterson family cabin, already weakened by the earlier ice dam damage, lost its entire south-facing roof section. Marcus Holden's recently repaired roof developed dangerous sagging despite his attempts to shovel it clear. The weight of snow combined with the structural damage from the previous collapse had compromised the integrity beyond repair. A trapper's cabin on the edge of the settlement simply folded inward under the load, the walls giving way when the roof came down. The community responded by consolidating. Families whose cabins had failed or seemed at risk moved into the more robust structures that were still standing. Thomas Brennan's cabin and 2 others became shelters for multiple families. The crowding was uncomfortable but necessary. Men took turns going outside in the storm to shovel roofs, exhausting dangerous work that had to be done every few hours to prevent additional failures. The snow continued falling steadily, and the physical labor of keeping ahead of the accumulation was wearing everyone down. By the third day, the situation had become critical. More than half the settlement's cabins had suffered some degree of damage. Food supplies were running low in the overcrowded refuge cabins because people had evacuated without time to gather supplies. Firewood was being consumed at an unsustainable rate. The storm showed no signs of ending, and exhaustion was affecting everyone's judgment and physical capability. People were making mistakes, injuries were occurring, and the community was approaching a breaking point. It was Thomas Brennan who first suggested that they try to reach Jacob's cabin. The idea seemed desperate, but Thomas remembered the stone bridge and Jacob's claims about its protective capabilities. If the formation was as protective as Jacob had described, it might offer shelter for at least some of the community until the storm passed. The suggestion was met with mixed reactions. Some people argued that traveling 4 miles through a blizzard was suicidal. Others pointed out that staying in collapsing cabins wasn't sustainable either. 6 men volunteered to make the attempt: Thomas, Marcus, and 4 others who were still physically capable of the journey. They would take minimal supplies and try to reach Jacob's location. If the stone bridge was accessible and offered genuine shelter, they could return and guide others. If they couldn't make it, at least the attempt would be made by men without families depending on them. They departed late on the 3rd afternoon, following what they hoped was the trail toward the high country. The 6 men struggled through snow that reached their waists in many places, following the ridge lines where wind had packed the snow somewhat and navigation was possible. The journey that normally took 2 hours in good conditions stretched into 5 brutal hours of forcing their way through drifts and fighting wind that seemed determined to push them back. Marcus Holden fell twice, exhausted, and had to be helped up by the others. By the time they saw the stone bridge formation in the distance, all 6 men were approaching the limits of their endurance. What they saw when they finally reached the alcove seemed impossible. The massive stone arch rose above them, and beneath it, the ground was nearly clear. Snow had accumulated in a few places where wind had driven it past the overhang, but the protected area was fundamentally dry and accessible. Jacob's cabin sat peacefully in the shelter, smoke rising from the chimney, warm light glowing from the windows. The contrast between the hellish conditions they had just traveled through and the calm sanctuary beneath the stone was so extreme that several men stopped and simply stared. Jakob had heard them coming. The acoustic properties of the space had carried the sound of their approach long before they arrived. He stood outside his cabin with his dog, watching as the 6 half-frozen men stumbled into the protected area and stopped, looking around with expressions that mixed exhaustion, relief, and disbelief. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice hoarse from cold and exertion. They needed shelter. The settlement was in crisis. Could Jacob help them? Jacob nodded without speaking and gestured them toward his cabin. The men crowded, inside filling the small space completely. Jakob built up the fire and began heating water. He pulled out every blanket he owned and distributed them to the men who were showing signs of serious cold exposure. For the first hour, no one spoke beyond necessary communication about warming up and treating minor frostbite. The men sat by the fire, slowly recovering, looking around at Jakob's well-built cabin with new appreciation for what he had accomplished. When everyone had warmed sufficiently, Thomas explained the situation in the settlement: the collapsed roofs, the crowded refuge cabins, the exhaustion and dwindling supplies. He asked if Jacob's stone bridge could shelter more people. Jakob considered the question carefully. The protected area was large enough for temporary camps if necessary. He had extra firewood and some supplies he could share, but moving entire families through the storm would be dangerous. Better to wait until the weather cleared, then help people relocate if They chose to. The storm finally ended during the night. By dawn of the fourth day, clear skies appeared and the temperature dropped sharply as the weather system moved on. The 6 men rested another day in Jacob's cabin, recovering strength, then began the journey back to the settlement to organize whatever came next. Spring came to the Wyoming high country in late March of 1843, melting the massive snow accumulation and revealing the storm's damage. 9 cabins in the settlement had been destroyed completely. Another 6 required major reconstruction. Jakob's remote cabin under the stone bridge had weathered the storm without damage, while most of the settlement barely survived. By early April, 3 families had relocated to areas where natural rock formations provided overhead protection. Cliff overhangs and boulder arrangements offered significant advantages over open-ground building. Jakob helped where he could, sharing principles about site selection and thermal considerations, though each location required unique solutions. The movement toward natural shelter accelerated over the following years. Trappers began actively seeking rock overhangs rather than building exposed cabins. By 1850, dozens of families throughout the territories lived in what people called bridge cabins or overhang settlements. These were settlers who recognized that working with natural geological features was smarter than fighting nature through construction alone. Jakob remained in his stone bridge cabin until 1864. He never remarried after Anna's death, though he maintained cordial relationships with the growing community. He trapped less as he aged, supporting himself through occasional carpentry. His dog died in 1856. He got another a year later, suggesting he valued companionship despite his solitary life. In spring 1864, Jakob sold his cabin to a young family who had sought the property because of its reputation. He moved west to Oregon Territory, seeking milder climate as his health declined. He died there in 1867 at age 52. There was no mention in the death record of his innovations or the lives his approach had likely saved. But the cabin remained, occupied continuously for 30 years by families who appreciated what Jakob had built. The structure required minimal maintenance because its design eliminated primary causes of frontier building failure. No snow accumulated, no wind stressed the walls. The thermal mass moderated temperature extremes. Historians have documented at least 17 confirmed instances where people survived dangerous winter conditions because they built shelters utilizing natural rock formations. The phrase "built under stone" became a compliment in frontier communities, indicating construction demonstrating intelligence rather than tradition. Jakob Eisner's contribution was never formally recognized during his lifetime. He received no awards, wrote no books, made no effort to promote his methods. But the principle he demonstrated influenced building practices across Western territories for decades. His stone bridge cabin stood as proof that unconventional thinking could solve problems conventional wisdom accepted as inevitable. Jakob had asked a question that seemed obvious once stated, but most people never thought to ask. Why accept that shelters fail? The answer was that failure wasn't inevitable if you stopped fighting nature and started working with geological features that had survived for millennia. A man who built his cabin under natural stone because his wife died when their conventional cabin collapsed had changed how people thought about frontier shelter, simply by building something that worked better. The impossible had become routine. A cabin surviving any Wyoming storm wasn't fantasy. It was recognizing that geological formation had already created perfect shelter. Jakob Eisner proved that with observation, site selection, and willingness to ignore skeptics, a person could build something genuinely superior. And in doing so, he left a legacy built into lives of people who learned that sometimes the best roof was one nature had already provided.